It was the 14th of June, 1969, and Clara Weston stood alone in the yard of a farm that was no longer anyone's dream. The funeral had been 3 days ago. The neighbors had come and gone in the way neighbors come and go in small Kansas counties, arriving with their casseroles and ceramic dishes, wrapped in dish towels with their careful, practiced condolences, with the quiet and predatory warmth of people who have decided what is going to happen and are being kind about it in advance. The house was silent now, in the way that only a house without its center can be. Not empty, because the furniture was there, and the dishes were in the cupboards, and the boots were by the back door, where they had always been, but hollow, the way a bell is hollow, the way something is hollow, when the thing that gave it resonance has been taken out. The smell of her father's pipe tobacco still lived in the walls, sweet and woody and specific. A smell so particular to him that breathing it in a room he was no longer in felt like a form of cruelty the house was inflicting on her without meaning to. She had not opened the windows. She was not ready to let it out. She was not ready for any of it, and yet here she was, 25 years old, standing in the June heat with the sun pressing down on the back of her neck and 900 acres of Kansas earth spread out before her in every direction, flat and golden, and entirely indifferent to her grief, waiting for whatever came next. Edward Weston had died on a Tuesday, which felt wrong to her in a way she could not fully articulate but could not stop thinking about. He was a man who belonged to Saturdays, to early mornings and long evenings, to the particular quality of Kansas light in the late afternoon when it turned the wheat fields the color of old honey and made even the most ordinary stretch of flat prairie look like something a painter had made up. He had worked this land for 31 years, from the time he was 31 years old, and had taken on the lease from old Hargreaves with nothing but a second-hand tractor and a line of credit that Pruitt's predecessor at the bank had extended with the specific skepticism of a man who expects to be proved right. He had built the farm from that starting point through 3 decades of ordinary hard work and ordinary worry, and the ordinary accumulation of knowledge about a particular piece of ground that comes from walking it every season. Learning it the way you learn anything that matters, slowly, incompletely, with the constant awareness that there is more to know. He had taught it to Clara the way some fathers teach their children religion, not through lectures, not through formal instruction, in the sense of sitting down and making a lesson of it, but through presence, through repetition, through the slow and patient accumulation of mornings spent side by side in the cab of a pickup truck driving the fence lines before the day. Properly started the radio playing something low and half audible while he talked about the soil, the way other men talked about things they had devoted their lives to. He would say things like, "This corner of the field drains differently than the rest because there's a clay layer about 14 inches down, and you can feel it in a wet year when the low spot holds water 2 days longer than everything around it, or that line of cottonwoods along the creek breaks the wind from the northwest, which is why the corn in the north-central section shows less stress in a dry August than you'd expect given the moisture readings." Small, specific, accumulated knowledge, the kind you can only get by staying. He had been 62 years old. His heart had given out in the east field on a Monday morning in early June, when the air had that quality it sometimes gets in Kansas in early summer, thick and still and faintly electric, as if the weather is thinking about doing something and hasn't decided what yet. He had been checking the soil moisture in the east quadrant, which was something he did by hand rather than by instrument, crouching down and pressing 2 fingers into the earth just below the surface and holding them there for a few seconds in the manner of a man taking a pulse. She had been in the barn when it happened. She had found him 40 minutes later face down in the second row from the fence, the soil cool against his cheek. She had sat with him there until the ambulance came because it seemed wrong to leave him in the field alone. The land she had inherited was 900 acres of Kansas earth, a battered case tractor that had been manufactured in 1957 and had the mechanical temperament of something that had been working hard for a long time and intended to continue working hard on its own terms, a set of equipment that ranged from serviceable to deeply unreliable, a debt to the First Agricultural Bank of Hayes that ran to just under $40,000 in principal and accumulated interest, and 3 leather-bound journals that she had found on the bottom shelf of his office and had not yet opened. She had found the journals the morning after the funeral, pulling them out from behind a row of agricultural manuals, the standard practical guides that farmers kept on their shelves, because they were the kind of thing farmers kept on their shelves, their spines uncracked and their pages clean. Reference material that existed primarily as evidence that the farmer who owned them was the kind of farmer who owned reference material. Behind these, pushed back against the wall where the shelf met the plaster, were 3 journals whose covers were worn smooth at the corners and whose leather had been darkened by years of handling to a color that suggested frequent use, the color of something that had been picked up and set down thousands of times. She had set them on the desk and left them there for 3 days. She was not ready for those yet either. Roy Callahan had come to the house the morning after the funeral, before the other neighbors arrived, and had found her in the kitchen. He was a large man, not simply large in the sense of physical scale, though he was that too, broad-shouldered and substantial in the way of men who have been doing physical work their entire lives, but large in the way of men who take up more space than their body strictly occupies, men whose presence fills a room beyond its physical dimensions. He had farmed the land that ran along her entire western boundary for more than 20 years. He was 61 years old and had the face of someone who had been outdoors in every kind of Kansas weather since before he could drive, tanned and creased and settled into an expression of permanent, moderate certainty. Not unkind, but not particularly curious, either the face of a man who has formed his views about the world over a long period of time and does not expect them to change. He sat at the kitchen table without being invited, which was the kind of thing he did, and he wrapped his large, calloused hands around the mug she set in front of him and looked at her with the expression of a man who has come to say something for someone else's own good and has organized himself for the task. "Clara," he said, "your father was a fine man, one of the best this county ever produced, and I mean that in every way a man can mean it. I knew Edward for 30 years, and I never once saw him act small or act dishonest, and that is more than you can say about most men. And because of the respect I had for him, and because of the care I have for you, I'm going to speak to you plainly, rather than dress it up in ways that make it harder to hear." He set down the mug. "This land is not a woman's burden to carry alone. There is no shame in that. There is nothing shameful about it at all. Farming has changed. The machinery alone requires capital that very few individual operators can maintain, and a place this size requires relationships with the elevator and the co-op and the lenders that take years to build, and that your father spent 30 years building, and that would need to be rebuilt from the beginning. I would give you a fair price for this land, more than fair. You would have enough to satisfy every debt Edward left, to set yourself up comfortably in Hayes, or even in Salina, if you wanted a bigger town, and to start fresh without any of this hanging over you." He paused. "Think of it as him taking care of you one more time." She thanked him for coming. She showed him to the door. It was not the last time she would hear the same message. Earl Hicks, at the co-op, delivered a version of it the following week, with the gentle condescension of a man who had watched her grow from a child into a young woman and had not in that process updated his mental image of what she was capable of. Pastor Dennison came on a Thursday evening and combined genuine pastoral concern for her well-being with the unmistakable implication that accepting the circumstances God had arranged, which in this case appeared to take the form of Roy Callahan's offer, would be an act of faith rather than defeat. Her father's cousin from Salina drove 4 hours to tell her in the most loving possible terms that she was 25 years old and had no experience managing an operation of this size, and that there was no shame in admitting it. Even Arthur Pruitt at the bank sent a letter that week, precise and measured and formally neutral in the way of bank letters, which managed to communicate simultaneously that the institution wished her well and that it would be happy to discuss the loan situation in the context of a potential sale to a qualified buyer. They all saw the same thing when they looked at her. A young woman alone, 25 years old, without a husband or a father or a son, standing in the middle of 900 acres of Kansas earth, with a bank debt and a machinery problem, and no obvious qualification for the task she had apparently decided to undertake. They were not most of them acting from malice. They were acting from the accumulated certainty of their experience and their community, from a genuine belief that they understood this situation, and that the kind thing to do was to point out the exit before she walked too far in a direction that would cost her more than she could afford to spend. What none of them understood, and what she lacked the language to explain in a way that would have mattered to them, was the nature and depth of what she had been given by 30 years of proximity to a man who understood this land. They saw a young woman who had been until 3 weeks ago her father's daughter. They did not see the 10,000 hours in the pickup truck. They did not see the conversations she had been having with this specific stretch of earth since before she could read conversations conducted in the language of boot soles and morning light, and the feel of soil in open hands, in the gradual, wordless accumulation of knowledge that comes from being present in a place long enough for it to become part of you. She stayed. She did not announce it. She simply did not call Callahan back. She did not respond to Pruitt's letter. She did not drive to Salina. On the 4th morning after the funeral, she went to her father's office, sat down at his desk, looked at the 3 journals for a long time, and then opened the first one. Edward Weston had been in the secret interior of his life, a scholar. This was not something she had known. It hit her with the specific force of a posthumous discovery, not the force of something terrible, but the force of something that reshapes your understanding of a person you thought you knew, that reveals dimensions you had not known to look for. The journals were not casual. They were not the casual record-keeping of a man who noted things down as an aide-memoire. They were the work of someone engaged in serious inquiry over a long period of time, collecting and cross-referencing and thinking carefully about what the evidence meant, pursuing a subject with the methodical persistence of someone who has decided that understanding it matters. The first journal was dated from the late 1950s, which meant he had been engaged in this inquiry for more than a decade before she was born, and had continued it in parallel with the farm and the mortgage and the raising of a daughter for her entire life, and she had never known. He had been keeping a secret life of the mind hidden on a bottom shelf behind unread agricultural manuals, and the discovery of it was one of the more disorienting experiences of those first weeks, not because it disturbed her image of him as a father, but because it expanded her image of him as a person in ways that felt simultaneously like a gift and like something taken from her, the knowledge of a dimension of him she would now never get to know directly. He had spent years, more than a decade's worth of entries, building and developing and returning to the same ideas from different angles, studying the agricultural practices of the people who had farmed this continent before the arrival of European settlers and European methods. He had read everything he could find about the agricultural systems of the Haudenosaunee, the Cherokee, the Lenape, the various nations of the eastern woodlands and the central plains, who had been cultivating this land for thousands of years before anyone arrived with opinions about row spacing and chemical fertilizers. He had corresponded with a professor at Kansas State. She found the letters carefully folded and tucked into the back of the second journal, the academic's replies written in precise, cautious language that was clearly the language of a man pleased to have found a farmer willing to engage seriously with material. He spent his professional life studying without much practical application in sight. He had read translated excerpts from medieval European farming texts that described crop rotation and soil management practices long abandoned in favor of the industrial model. He had sent away for pamphlets from organizations whose names did not appear in any of the agricultural directories she was familiar with, organizations working in the space between academic research and practical farming, the space that the county extension office had never acknowledged existed. At the center of everything in those journals, the axis around which all the inquiry revolved, was one idea: a system of farming so old and so thoroughly superseded by the machinery of modern agriculture that it existed now only in the academic literature and in the memory of the communities who had developed it. A system he called in his own notes, using a name she had encountered before, without context, the three sisters: corn, beans, squash, not planted in rows. This was the essential departure, the thing that made it incomprehensible to the men at the co-op, and incompatible with the machinery of modern agriculture and invisible as an agricultural system to anyone who had been trained to think of farming in terms of row spacing and combined clearance. The three sisters were planted together in clusters in wide circular mounds of loosened earth raised several inches above the surrounding grade in a spatial arrangement that was not geometric but ecological, not designed by an engineer for the convenience of machinery, but developed over centuries by careful observers of plant behavior for the benefit of the plants themselves. The corn was planted first near the center of each mound, where its tall stalk would rise above the surrounding vegetation and catch the maximum light. But the corn's role in the system was not merely to produce corn. Its strong, upright stalk served as a natural trellis for the beans that would follow it, the vine of the climbing bean wrapping itself around the cornstalk and ascending toward the light without the need for any artificial support. The bean, in turn, was doing something that her father's journals described in terms that made it sound almost miraculous. Though the mechanism was thoroughly understood by science through nodules on its roots, colonized by nitrogen-fixing bacteria. The bean plant was drawing nitrogen directly from the air, pulling it out of the atmosphere and converting it into a form that plants could absorb through their roots and depositing it in the soil around the mound, feeding the corn and the squash and the soil community simultaneously, acting as a natural fertilizer factory that required no bags from the co-op and no expense on the operating statement. And the squash was the third genius of the system, the element that transformed it from a clever companion planting arrangement into something more complete and more powerful. The squash vines spread outward from the base of each mound in every direction, extravagantly covering the ground between the mounds in an expanding canopy of enormous leaves that by midsummer formed a nearly unbroken cover over the entire planted area. This canopy did three things simultaneously, each of them critically important. It shaded the soil from the direct sun, dramatically reducing the evaporation of soil moisture on hot, dry days. It trapped the dew that formed in the cool of the early morning, holding it against the soil surface until it could be absorbed, and it suppressed the weeds that would otherwise compete with the corn and beans for resources, creating a living mulch that required no additional labor and improved rather than depleted the soil beneath it. His sketches of the system were precise and patient, the work of a man who had looked carefully at something and tried to render it accurately. Root systems shown in cross-section the different depths and lateral spreads of the three species diagrammed in relation to each other. Canopy views showing the geometry of the mounds and the spacing between them. Seasonal diagrams showing the progression of the system through the growing year from the first corn shoots to the full summer canopy to the autumn harvest. He had tried it in a half-acre plot behind the barn. The journals documented this experiment carefully over 2 growing seasons in the mid-60s. The yield from the half-acre was not dramatically higher than comparable monoculture plots of the same size he had not expected it to be, and the journals were clear-eyed about this. The system's advantage was not in immediate yield. The system's advantage was in what it did to the soil over time, and in what healthy soil eventually produced in the way of sustained and resilient abundance. The half-acre plot showed it already in the 2 seasons he had documented. The earthworm population was 3 times higher than in the surrounding ground. The soil structure was measurably different, looser, more porous, darker in color, with a texture between the fingers that spoke of organic matter and biological activity, rather than the dense, compacted, chemically saturated earth of the surrounding fields. After a dry spell that left the rest of the farm showing stress, the Three Sisters plot remained green and productive, the squash canopy holding moisture in the soil that the surrounding bare earth had long since surrendered to the air. But he had never scaled it up. He had never taken the system from the experimental half-acre and applied it to the 900 acres that constituted his life's work and his life's debt. The journals were honest about the reasons, cataloging them with the same care he brought to everything. The bank would not have extended a line of credit for an unproven method that could not be harvested with standard equipment. The co-op would not have understood the seed order, and the conversation that would have followed would have been the kind of conversation that traveled in a county like this one to every ear before the week was out. The machinery did not exist. There was no planter in Rooks County, and possibly none in the state of Kansas, designed to plant 3 different seeds in mounded clusters rather than single seed rows, and fabricating one was a significant engineering project that was beyond his resources, or possibly beyond what he could justify allocating his resources to. And there was a daughter to raise, and a mortgage that needed the predictable yield of a predictable system, and a community of peers whose good opinion was both practically important and personally meaningful to a man who had lived among them for 30 years. He had written near the very end of the 3rd journal, in an entry dated October of the previous year, 8 months before the Monday morning in the East Field, 8 months before everything changed, a single paragraph that she read 3 times in a row, sitting at his desk in the afternoon light before she set the journal down. The older I get, the more clearly I see that I have been a coward about this. I have known for 15 years, perhaps longer, if I am being scrupulously honest with myself, that there is a better way to work this land. Not just a marginally better way, but a fundamentally different way, a way that works with the land rather than against it, that builds what we keep depleting, that creates the conditions for long-term abundance rather than consuming those conditions in the pursuit of short-term yield. And I have spent 15 years constructing reasons not to try it. The bank, the neighbors, the machinery, the risk, the timing. There is always a reason, and the reasons are not entirely false. They have real weight. They describe real obstacles. But if I sit here in this office in the October evening and look at myself honestly, what I see is not a man who was prevented from doing what he knew was right. I see a man who was afraid of being wrong in public, afraid of the laughter at the co-op and what it would do to 30 years of carefully maintained standing in this community, afraid of Callahan's face when he looked at my fields. The land has been trying to tell me something for 30 years, and I have been too much of a coward to listen. Perhaps someone braver than me will listen one day. Perhaps the land is more patient than I deserve. I hope so. She sat at the desk for a long time after she set the journal down. The afternoon light moved across the floor. The smell of tobacco was in the room. Outside, the Kansas evening was settling over the fields, the light going golden and then amber and then the deep saturated orange of a June sunset, the shadows lengthening across the 900 acres that were hers. Now in all the ways a piece of land can be yours. legally, financially, emotionally, and in the particular way that land becomes yours when you have been learning it since before you could name the learning, when it is woven into you at a level below conscious knowledge. She understood what he had left her. She understood all of it now, not just the deed and the debt, not just the equipment and the obligations, but the secret thing, the thing he had spent 15 years being too afraid to pursue. He had left her his dream in the same way people leave things they cannot bring themselves to throw away and cannot bring themselves to use, carefully preserved, hidden from the people who would not have understood it, waiting for someone who might. He had not planned this, she was fairly certain. The journals were not a message written to her. They were a private record of a private inquiry, and the fact that they were now in her hands was the result of his dying unexpectedly at 62 and leaving her as the sole person with access to his office and its bottom shelf. But the effect was the same. He had given her a direction. He had given her something to be brave about. She picked up the third journal and walked outside into the evening heat and stood in the middle of the yard for a while, looking at the 900 acres in the fading light, feeling the weight of the decision that was forming in her. She was 25 years old. She had 3 months of savings. She did not own a combine harvester, and what she was planning could not in any case be harvested with one. She had never managed a farming operation at this scale. She had never negotiated a line of credit alone, or driven a truckload of grain to market alone, or hired labor, or managed the full complexity of running a 900-acre farm through an entire growing season without another adult in the house. But she had 10,000 hours in the pickup truck, and she had her father's hands, and she had what he had left her. She set the journal down on the porch railing and walked to the barn and turned on the work light and pulled the planter out to the middle of the floor and stood looking at it with her hands in her pockets, thinking about what it would need to become. The co-op on a Tuesday morning in the second week of June was the specific social institution it had always been, a low-ceilinged building with fluorescent lighting and a concrete floor that had been poured in 1948 and had the cracks to prove it, presided over by Earl Hicks from behind a long counter that disappeared under seed catalogs and order forms in a way that suggested the counter had not been fully visible since sometime in the early 1960s. It smelled of fertilizer and burnt coffee, and the particular composite smell of a place where physical things and commercial transactions happen in close proximity over a long period of time. It was the social center of the farming community in a way that was not incidental to its commercial function, but constitutive of it. You went there to buy things, and you went there to know things, and the knowing and the buying were part of the same transaction. Clara arrived at 8:30 on a Tuesday morning, parked the truck in the gravel lot between a John Deere pickup and Roy Callahan's green International, whose dented passenger door she recognized from 100 yards. She walked in through the propped open door and set her father's third journal open to his planting diagrams on the counter in front of Earl Hicks. "I need to put in a seed order," she said. "Corn pole beans and summer squash, enough for 900 acres. The pause that followed was the specific pause of a man whose mind has moved quickly to a conclusion and who is now managing the question of how to respond in a way that is appropriate to the social situation. Earl Hicks took off his glasses and polished them on his shirt, which was something he did when he was giving himself a moment. Behind her, she could feel the room's ambient conversation losing momentum, the talk trailing off in the way it does when something more interesting than the current conversation has presented itself. "Clara," Earl said, using the tone of voice he had been using with her since she was 7 years old, the tone that communicated kindness and the assumption of a certain limited capacity on the part of the person being spoken to. That's a big garden order, honey. What are you actually planning for the season?" "That is what I'm actually planning," she said. "You can't run a combine through squash vines and bean poles," Callahan's voice from behind her and to the left, carrying with the effortless volume of a man accustomed to being heard. "How are you proposing to harvest 900 acres of that arrangement?" She turned to look at him. He was standing near the feedbag pallets with his arms folded and an expression that managed to be both dismissive and, she thought, faintly curious, the expression of a man who does not take what he is hearing seriously, but is interested in a detached way in how the person saying it will respond to the obvious objection. "By hand, if I have to," she said. The laughter began at the back of the room. It was not cruel, or not primarily cruel, which she wanted to be accurate about even later, even with all the reasons she had to remember it otherwise. It was the laughter of people who believe they are looking at something they understand completely, who are confirming for each other the shared knowledge that this situation is exactly what it looks like. It was the laughter of a community enforcing its own sense of what was possible and what was not. She paid for her seeds in cash from an envelope she had prepared, counting the bills out carefully on the counter, while the conversation behind her resumed at a volume designed to include her as an audience. She heard it as she was picking up the receipt. "Weston's Folly," someone said. Graves, she thought, or possibly Sutton. The tone was amused and certain and final, the tone of a name being assigned to something that has already been categorized. She loaded the seeds into the truck and drove home without stopping anywhere, the seeds in the bed behind her, and the journal on the seat beside her, and the name following her down the county road at the pace of a community's certainty which travels faster than any truck. The First Agricultural Bank of Hayes had occupied its brick building on Main Street since 1891, a span of time that gave the institution a solidity and an authority that it traded on consciously and carefully. Arthur Pruitt had managed it for 22 years and had in that time developed a settled and reliable view of the agricultural economy of Rooks County and the people who constituted it. He was a thin, careful man who dressed with a deliberate formality that was slightly in excess of what the county required, which was not an accident but a statement. The statement that the office he occupied operated according to different rules than the world outside it, that the math inside this building was not subject to the enthusiasms and the hopes and the errors of judgment that governed ordinary human decision-making. He had, in 22 years, seen enough farmers stake their operations on ideas that did not survive contact with a dry summer or a bad market to have developed a thorough and professionally grounded skepticism about departures from proven practice. He listened to Clara's proposal without expression. She had prepared carefully. She had spent 3 evenings reading the science underlying what her father had documented, going beyond the journals to the agricultural research literature that Finch's letters had pointed her toward, working through what she could access from the library in Hayes. She had organized the material the way she had observed that Pruitt preferred things sequentially, evidentially, without appeals to sentiment or personal narrative. She brought the journals. She explained nitrogen fixation in terms a man with a financial background could follow. She showed him the yield projections her father had developed for years 3 and 4 of a 3 sisters system. She described the soil science, the relationship between organic matter content and water retention, between biological activity and long-term fertility, as clearly and precisely as she could manage. When she finished, he looked at the journal she had placed on his desk for a moment, and then he closed it with a care that was its own kind of dismissal and pushed it gently back toward her. "Clara." His voice was not unkind, but it was what it was, the voice of an institution declining a request. "Your father was clearly a thoughtful man, and these notes represent a significant amount of careful reading, but the bank does not extend credit based on thoughtful notes. We extend credit based on demonstrated yields, collateralizable assets, and proven farming methods with known risk profiles. What you are describing does not meet any of those criteria. It cannot be harvested with standard equipment, which makes your harvesting costs unpredictable at best and prohibitive at worst. It has never been attempted at this scale, which means there is no yield data and no basis for financial modeling, and it represents a departure from every assumption underlying the valuation of the land and equipment that constitute your collateral." He paused, and let the weight of the words settle. Mr. Callahan has made a standing offer for your property. It is a serious offer from a credit-worthy operator with a demonstrated track record. I would encourage you to take it. I am not selling, she said. He sighed. It was the sigh of a man who has watched people make predictable mistakes from the vantage point of someone who could see them coming and could not prevent them. He opened a folder that he had already prepared, which told her he had expected this conversation to go this way. Your father maintained a secondary savings account separate from the operating accounts. The balance is $4,200. I am prepared to authorize a loan against 60% of that balance, approximately $2,500, which I will extend as an agricultural operating loan for the current season. He closed the folder. I want to be plain with you about what this means in practical terms. $2,500 is not sufficient capital to operate a 900-acre farm through a full growing season by conventional methods. It is not designed to succeed. It is designed to allow you to make an attempt, which I believe you are determined to make, regardless of what I say, before the financial realities make further operation impossible. He looked at her steadily. I am extending this as a courtesy to your father's memory, and because it is my professional judgment that you will have exhausted these funds and reconsidered your position before the end of the growing season. She took the money. She thanked him for his time. She stood up and shook his hand with the firmness of someone who has decided something. She drove home in the late afternoon, the long Kansas shadows crossing the road in front of her, the air warm and smelling of dust, and something underneath it. The particular smell of earth in early summer, before anything has been planted, when the ground still holds the memory of the winter and the promise of what the season might produce. She pulled into the yard and sat in the truck for a moment, with the engine off, looking at the barn and the equipment shed and the fields stretching in every direction under the enormous Kansas sky. $2,500, 900 acres, one woman, a dead man's dream, a bank loan calibrated to fail, a county full of people who had already written the ending. She got out of the truck and walked to the barn. The machine was wrong for the job. She had known this from the first hour she spent examining it after the funeral, and she had spent the 2 weeks since then working through the engineering problem of how to make it right. Her father's planter was a good machine for what it had been built to do, drop a single variety of seed into a prepared furrow at consistent intervals with the regularity and efficiency of a mechanism designed for that specific purpose and nothing else. For the three sisters, it was useless in its current form. The three sisters required a fundamentally different planting geometry, wide raised mounds of loosened earth elevated 4 to 6 inches above the surrounding soil, spaced approximately 4 feet from center to center, with 3 different seeds placed at 3 different depths and 3 different horizontal positions within each mound. The corn at the center and deepest in the position of greatest soil, warmth, and moisture. The beans in a ring around the corn at medium depth, where their roots would establish in the nitrogen-rich zone between the corn and the outer edge. The squash at the perimeter of the mound, shallower, positioned to spread outward across the intervening ground between mounds. No machine in Rooks County had been built for this. No machine in any county she knew of had been built for this, because the agricultural machinery industry had not in its entire history been asked to produce a machine for planting in this configuration. The three sisters had been planted by hand for thousands of years and had then been replaced by a system that required no such machine, and so no such machine existed. She would have to build one, or rather, she would have to modify what she had into something that could do what she needed, which was a different problem, a problem of fabrication and modification rather than design from scratch, and a problem that was within the range of what her father had taught her to do in the barn with the welding equipment and the metalworking tools she had been using since she was 16. She spent the first 3 weeks of June in the barn, working from the diagrams in the journals and from her own increasingly confident reading of the mechanical problem. She extended the planter's arms, using steel stock from the equipment shed, fabricating brackets and extensions that would produce the wider mound spacing. She built new seed drops from copper tubing and sheet metal, shaping each one to match the geometry she needed for the 3 seed types. She rigged a secondary hopper above the main hopper for the bean seed and fabricated a third wider funnel arrangement for the squash, engineering the feed mechanism so that all 3 seeds would drop into the correct positions within each mound in a single pass. She burned her forearm once on the welding equipment and cut her left hand twice on sheet metal edges, and spent an afternoon attacking a corroded bolt with penetrating oil and a cheater bar until her hands were shaking and the bolt had moved approximately 1/4 of an inch, and she went inside and ate dinner and came back out and finished it. She tested it on the south field on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of June, taking the rebuilt machine out to the section of the farm where the soil was deepest and most forgiving. She made a single pass, shut off the tractor, climbed down, and walked the length of what she had just planted, crouching every few feet to brush the loose soil aside and examine the placement. The corn seed was where it needed to be. The beans were mostly in the correct position, with some variation toward the center that she could correct by adjusting the feed timing. The squash was the least consistent, the funnel geometry not quite producing the lateral spread she needed, depositing some seeds too close to the center of the mound. She noted each problem. She went back to the barn. She made 3 more modifications over the following 2 days, testing after each one on a small section of the south field. On the 3rd iteration, the machine did what she needed it to do. Not perfectly. Nothing she built ever worked perfectly, but acceptably, with the 3 seeds in reasonable positions within each mound and the mound spacing and geometry matching what the journals had described. She put in the full planting order the following morning. The planting itself took 5 weeks of work from before sunrise to after sunset. She drove the tractor across 900 acres in the deliberate, methodical grid the journals had described, making pass after pass, building up the rows of mounds across section after section of the farm. She lost a bearing in the 3rd week, a deep-seated mechanical failure that stopped her cold for 4 days while she waited for the part, and during those 4 days she prepared seed beds in the sections she had already planned for the following week, working with the broad fork, driving it into the soil by hand, and working it back and forth to loosen the earth and raise the mounds manually. It was slow work and exhausting work, and it made her back ache in a way that she knew from experience was going to be with her for the rest of the summer. She ran short of pole bean seed at about 800 acres, a miscalculation she blamed on her own measurement error in the early planning, and drove to a supplier in the next county who had a similar but not identical variety, and spent 2 nights wondering whether the difference in the bean variety would matter. The journals didn't specify. The system was robust enough that she decided the risk was acceptable, and she planted the substitute variety in the remaining sections and watched them through the summer to see how they differed. They differed in ways she could measure and none that seemed to matter. The neighbors watched from the county road. She knew this because she could see it from the tractor seat, the trucks that moved past the farm at the particular pace of a vehicle whose driver has somewhere to go but is in no hurry to arrive. They watched and they talked, and the talking reached her through Dale after Dale arrived in the form of what people were saying at the co-op and the feed store, and in the conversations that stopped when she walked into them. She kept driving. Dale Morrow appeared on a Wednesday morning in the last week of July, standing at the far end of the lane with his hat in both hands and the specific posture of a man who has come to ask for something and is uncertain about his welcome. He was 23 years old, brown and lean from outdoor work, with gray eyes that had a quality of direct attention that could be read, depending on who was reading it, as either alertness or wariness. He had lost his father's land to foreclosure the previous autumn, 300 acres 8 miles east, 20 years of his father. Arthur Morrow's work, absorbed by the machinery of a bank, exercising its contractual rights, which is a machinery that operates without any particular speed or urgency because it doesn't need to. He had been living in Hayes since then, doing work where he could find it. He had heard about Clara's farm from Earl Hicks. He told her, which meant he had heard about Weston's folly, and he had driven out on the theory that a farm being run by someone who was apparently doing something without a clear precedent might at least need labor that it couldn't otherwise attract. "Have you heard of companion planting?" she asked. He had not heard of companion planting. She went inside and came back with the first journal and handed it to him. "Read this," she said. "All of it. Come back Monday if you're still interested in working here." He came back Monday, carrying the journal in both hands and wearing the expression of a man who has read something that required more mental revision than he had expected when he sat down with it. He gave her back the journal without speaking immediately, and she interpreted this correctly as the silence of someone still processing. "Walk with me," she said. She took him through the south field, where the corn was already a foot above the surface, and the bean vines were beginning their first tentative reaches upward. She explained the system, the way her father had explained it to himself in the journals, not as a technique, but as a relationship, not as a methodology, but as a community of organisms engaged in a kind of mutual support that had been refined over centuries. The corn and the beans and the squash were not 3 crops sharing a space out of convenience. They were participants in a system that had been selected over long periods of time by people who understood through patient observation and accumulated generational knowledge that certain combinations of plants helped each other survive in ways that no individual plant could achieve alone. Dale listened without interrupting. He looked at the plants. He crouched down at one of the mounds and examined the soil around the base of a cornstalk, pressing his fingers in and drawing them out and looking at what they showed him. "My father's land never had soil like this," he said. "This is only the first season," she said. "Wait." He started work the following morning and proved to be over the weeks and months that followed exactly what the farm needed, a man who worked without requiring constant direction, who observed carefully and thought carefully and modified what he was doing based on what he saw, rather than on what he had been told to expect, who had the farmer's fundamental understanding that no 2 sections of ground are exactly alike, and that working land well requires paying attention to the specific rather than applying the general. He was not immediately convinced of the system's merits. She could see this in the first weeks, the slight reservation in his manner when she explained the theory behind something, the careful neutrality of a man doing a job he has agreed to do without yet having formed a view about whether it was a good job to do. He was honest about this when she asked him directly in the second week of August. "I think you believe what you're doing," he said. "I'm not sure yet what I think about whether it works." "Fair enough," she said. He became a believer, not through argument or persuasion, but through his hands, which was the only way anyone ever really became a believer about anything that happened in the soil. It happened in stages that she watched from a middle distance the first time he crouched at the edge of a bean mound in late August and held the soil between his fingers and looked at it with the expression of someone encountering something unexpected. The morning in early September, when he came to find her in the barn to report with a matter-of-fact precision that barely concealed the astonishment underneath it that the earthworm count in the Three Sisters sections was running at a density he had never seen in soil under active cultivation. The afternoon he sat on an overturned bucket at the edge of the field for 20 minutes without doing anything visible, just looking with the specific quality of attention that means a person is thinking hard about what they are seeing. She did not mark these moments aloud. She let them accumulate. By the end of the first season, the yield was modest. She had expected it to be modest. The journals were clear on this point, and she had internalized it thoroughly enough that the modesty of the yield did not shake her in the way that it might have shaken someone who had expected immediate dramatic results. The yield was approximately 60% of what a comparable monoculture corn crop would have produced in a normal year on the same acreage. It was enough to make the minimum payment to the bank. It was enough to buy seed for the following season. It was enough to pay Dale's wages and cover the fuel and the parts. It was enough to survive into the next year, which was all she needed it to be. Callahan drove past the farm on a Saturday afternoon in mid-October, slowly in his green International. She watched him from the porch, and he did not stop. She watched the truck disappear around the bend in the county road and felt the familiar weight of his certainty, not oppressive in the old way, but present still. Present, the awareness of a man who believed that time was working in his favor and that patience was the only strategy he needed. He was not entirely wrong about the time and the patience. He was wrong about whose side they were on. The second year, the nitrogen that the beans had been fixing into the soil since the first season began to produce results that were visible to anyone who knew what they were looking at. The corn in the Three Sisters sections was growing taller and darker than anything she had seen on comparable ground under conventional management. The difference between the Three Sisters sections and the small monoculture control section she maintained at the north end of the farm was by mid-July of the second year, striking enough to be visible from a moving vehicle on the county road. The squash had established itself across the ground between the mounds with an almost aggressive completeness. The canopy by August nearly unbroken, the leaves enormous and healthy and dark, in the way that plants are dark when they are growing in soil that has what they need. She measured the soil moisture under the squash canopy at the height of a dry August and compared it to the moisture readings in the control section and in samples she took from Callahan's fence line with his permission, which he gave with the casual certainty of a man who expected the data to confirm what he already believed. The readings were not subtle. The soil under the Three Sisters canopy was holding moisture at a rate significantly above what the surrounding ground was showing, and what the surrounding ground was showing was not bad. By Kansas standards, it was a reasonably good moisture year. The difference she was measuring was not the difference between a dry year and a wet one. It was the difference between soil that had been prepared for moisture retention and soil that had not. She did not share these readings with anyone except Dale, who noted them in the farm log she had started keeping with the same methodical precision her father had brought to his journals. The yield in the second year improved. Not dramatically, not the kind of improvement that would have drawn attention or silenced the co-op, but consistently and across the whole farm in a way that told her the system was working everywhere rather than in isolated sections. Approximately 75% of what a comparable monoculture year would have produced. Better than the first year. Less than conventional. Enough to make the bank payment comfortably with a margin she had not had the year before. In the third year, a professor from Kansas State drove out to her farm. He came with Arthur Pruitt, which was the first unusual thing about the visit. Pruitt made farm calls when borrowers were in trouble, which was a known pattern, not a surprise. Pruitt making a farm call in the company of an academic from the agronomy department was not a pattern she had seen before, and was not something she had prepared for. The academic's name was Harold Finch. He was in his late 50s, with the particular physical quality of someone who spent significant time outdoors, despite holding an office, the hands of a man who handled earth rather than paper. The slight permanent squint of someone who spent time looking at landscapes in bright light. He explained that he had become aware of her farming operation through a chain of informal communications that had started with Earl Hicks at the co-op and had traveled through several intermediary conversations before reaching someone in his department who had mentioned it to him. He was He said, a specialist in soil science with a secondary interest in pre-industrial agricultural systems, and what he had been hearing about the soil conditions on her farm was sufficiently anomalous that he had wanted to see it for himself. He wanted to take samples. She looked at Pruitt, who was standing slightly to Finch's left, with the expression of a man who has facilitated something and is reserving judgment about whether facilitating it was the right call. "I am observing," Pruitt said. "Of course," she said. And to Finch, "Help yourself." He took 11 samples from locations distributed across the farm, working with the methodical efficiency of someone who has done this many times before, placing each core carefully in a labeled container, noting data in a small notebook. He walked the entire planted area over 4 hours, moving slowly, stopping often, crouching frequently. At one point in the south field, she watched from 30 yards as he sat back on his heels in the middle of a bean section and went completely still for what she estimated was 3 minutes, not examining anything, not writing anything, just sitting in the field with the posture of a man whose categories had just been quietly rearranged. When he was leaving, he paused at the edge of the field with his sample kit and looked at her with an expression that was, she thought, the expression of a scientist trying to hold off a premature conclusion. 6 to 8 weeks for results, he said. I'll be in touch. She thought about the samples for weeks after he left. She thought about what they might show and what they might mean, and what Finch would do with what they showed, and what that might mean for the farm, for her position with the bank, for the conversations at the co-op, for the whole complicated balance of forces that had been in an uneasy equilibrium for 3 years and that she was not yet ready to disturb. She was not ready yet. She needed one more season. The results arrived 7 weeks after Finch's visit, in a letter on Kansas State letterhead, typed in the careful professional language of an academic presenting data. She read it standing at the kitchen counter with the same quality of attention she had given to the bank letters and the legal documents and the financial statements, the attention of a person reading for consequences. The nitrogen content of her soil was 340% above the regional average for active agricultural land in dryland Kansas. The organic matter content was 4 times the county median. The microbial biomass, the population of bacteria and fungi that constitute the invisible engine of soil, fertility breaking down organic matter into nutrients, creating the chemical and structural environment in which plant roots can function, was substantially elevated beyond what existing models predicted for cultivated soil. The water retention capacity was described in language that a scientist uses when he wants to be technically accurate, but cannot quite contain the fact that what he is describing is remarkable. The earthworm population density was 18 times the sample average from the neighboring farms. She called Finch the afternoon the letter arrived. "I want you to publish it," she said. "I know you want to, but I need you to wait." There was a pause on the line. "How long?" "1 more season, until after the 1973 harvest." She explained the situation with the debt. She explained Callahan's position as a creditor, which she had learned from Dale's source at the title office and which Finch had not known about. She explained that if the scientific interest in her farm became public before she had demonstrated a full cycle of documented production, the attention would arrive at a moment when she was still financially exposed, when Callahan still held a position that could be exercised against her in the right circumstances. 1 more season of documented production. 1 more year of proof that the system was not a curiosity, but a working agricultural operation. Then Finch could publish whatever he wanted. 1 year, Finch said. "I'll hold the paper for 1 year." She put down the phone and went back to work. Dale brought her the news about the debt purchase on an evening in late November, sitting at the kitchen table with his coat still on because he had come in directly from the truck, his face carrying the expression of a man who has discovered something he wishes he hadn't and is now managing the question of how to deliver it. He had been in Hayes for a brake part and had run into a man he knew at the title office who had mentioned the transaction in passing under the assumption that Clara already knew. Callahan had acquired a significant portion of her operating loan debt from Pruitt's institution. The mechanics of it were a standard form of agricultural financial maneuvering, a creditor selling debt to a third party at a discount, the kind of transaction that happened regularly and was recorded in documents that were technically public but practically invisible unless you knew to look for them. The effect was straightforward. If the farm defaulted on its loan, Callahan's position as a creditor would put him near the front of the line for the asset that secured the debt. He had done this in the first year, probably. While she was in the barn, welding modifications onto the planter, while she was walking the south field at dawn, checking on the first plantings, while she was reading her father's journals. For the 5th and 10th time, Roy Callahan had been quietly acquiring the financial instrument that would allow him to take the land even if she never sold voluntarily. "He's been planning this for 4 years, Dale said. He was watching her face carefully, the way you watch someone's face when you have delivered news that might produce a range of responses. "Yes," she said. "So have I." But there was a night in December that came as close as anything in 4 years to breaking her. It was the 15th of the month. The temperature had dropped to 8 degrees overnight, which was cold even by Kansas winter standards, and she had been in the barn since 8 in the morning trying to repair a stress fracture in the cultivator's main frame, a crack that had appeared in the steel at the modified joint, the place where the additional weight of her extended configuration had been working against the original structural geometry for 3 growing seasons. She had welded it twice. Both times the weld had held for 20 minutes and then failed, the crack opening again slightly to the left of where she had sealed it. She couldn't tell whether it was a bad weld or a problem with the base metal at that location, or simply a consequence of the modification being more structurally compromised than she had realized when she made it. What she could tell was that she had now spent 10 hours in the cold without solving the problem, that her hands were raw from the cold, and the work that her back had been a source of continuous low-grade complaint since September, and that she had about enough money in the account for 1 more set of seeds and 1 more season's fuel, and not a significant amount beyond that. She sat on the floor of the barn, with the welding hood pushed up on her head, and the single work lamp making long, uneven shadows on the walls, and the cultivator's broken frame in front of her, and she felt the full weight of the thing she had committed to. Not the physical weight which was a companion she had made her peace with a long time ago, the other kind of weight, the weight of having been right about something for 4 years in a world that could not yet see that she was right, and of not knowing still in the cold of December in the 4th year whether the proof she was building was going to arrive before she ran out of the resources required to keep building it. She sat there for a while without moving. Then she went inside and got the 3rd journal and came back to the office and sat on the floor and read it aloud. Not to study the technique. She knew the technique. She read it aloud because she needed to hear the words in a voice in the silence of the house, and her own voice was the only voice she had for this purpose now. She read the passage about the land being a community. She read the one about cooperation over command, about the farmer who joins nature rather than fighting it. She read the October entry, the one about cowardice and 15 wasted years, and the hope expressed with more humility than confidence that someone braver might one day try. Her voice broke at the end of that last passage, and she let it break, and she sat there in the office with the journal in her lap, and the lamp on, and the Kansas winter outside the window, absolute and dark and entirely indifferent, and she let herself feel the full loneliness of the thing she had taken on before she put it away again. She sat there until she was done. Then she dried her face on her sleeve and went back to the barn and worked on the cultivator for another 2 hours. She found the problem on the 4th attempt, a hairline crack in the base metal, running perpendicular to the fracture she had been trying to repair, invisible under normal lighting, but visible under the work lamp at a specific angle. She ground down the area, built up the weld carefully over the full extent of the underlying crack, rather than the surface fracture, let it cool slowly and tested it. It held. She tested it again in the yard at midnight by the light of the truck's headlights, running the mechanism through its full range of motion. It held. She stood in the cold yard for a moment in the truck's light and looked at the dark fields around her, the fields she had planted and tended and was building into something, and then she went inside and slept. Spring was coming. The ground was ready. She could feel it there beneath the frozen surface, the biological community she had spent 4 years building, patient and dark and alive, holding everything she had put into it, waiting for the season to begin. The spring of 1973 arrived with a stillness that felt to Clara like something that was trying not to be noticed. She had grown up in Kansas and had spent her entire life learning its weathers in the way that you learn any language you have been immersed in since birth, not through study, but through the slow accumulation of exposures until comprehension becomes a form of instinct rather than cognition. She knew the smell of incoming rain and the specific texture of a sky that had made up its mind about what it was going to do. She knew the difference between a dry week and a dry month and a dry season, the way you know the difference between a person having a bad day and a person undergoing something more fundamental. What she felt that spring, beginning in March and deepening through April, was not a bad week. It was a sky that had made a decision. April was dry in the way that April in Kansas is sometimes dry, noticeably worth mentioning at the co-op, enough to make farmers look more carefully at their soil moisture readings and think about their irrigation schedules, but not beyond the range of what the county had experienced and recovered from many times. By mid-May, the language had changed. The creeks were running low. The pastures in the county's eastern sections were showing stress earlier than they typically did. The radio station began including water table updates in its morning agricultural reports. By the end of June, the word drought appeared in the county newspaper for the first time in more than a decade, and the farmers who remembered the last one were not dismissing the comparison. Clara and Dale had been preparing since April. Not in the dramatic way of people responding to a crisis, but in the quiet, methodical way of people who have been building toward a particular kind of test for 4 years and who can feel the test approaching. They adjusted the squash spacing to maximize the canopy coverage for the season, filling gaps in the previous year's distribution to ensure that by midsummer, the living mulch would be as complete and unbroken as possible. They added composted organic material around each mound straw and previous year's squash vines and kitchen compost to supplement the soil's natural mulch and provide additional moisture retention. They checked and serviced every element of the modest gravity-fed irrigation system her father had installed, testing each valve and each pipe junction. They did not use the irrigation system yet. They were not sure they would need to. The neighboring farms continued doing what they had always done because there was no reason visible to them from inside the model they were operating in to do anything else. Their soil was what it had always been. Their practices were what they had always been. The drought was an external condition to be managed through irrigation, and they would irrigate more, and the aquifer would supply what was needed, and the season would be difficult, but the crop would be made. This was the assumption. It was a reasonable assumption based on all previous experience. It was wrong in the specific way that assumptions become wrong when they are tested by conditions outside the range for which the assumption was designed. July arrived with a quality of heat that the county had not experienced in 30 years, and those who remembered the last time it had been like this were not wrong to remember it with apprehension. The temperature reached 107 on the 14th of July. It did not drop below 90 for the following 3 weeks. The air was almost completely without humidity, not merely dry, but aggressively dry, the kind of air that pulls moisture out of exposed surfaces with a persistence that you can measure against the inside of your mouth at the end of a day, outdoors. The sky was the pale, bleached white of extreme heat, cloudless in the specific way that feels permanent rather than temporary, the kind of sky that does not appear to be waiting for anything. The monoculture farms began to fail. They failed from the ground up, the way soil-based systems fail invisibly first in the places you couldn't see, in the capillary structure of the topsoil as it lost moisture, and then hardened as it lost moisture, and then began to crack as the hardening progressed. The organic matter that would have held water in a living soil was absent. Decades of tillage and chemical treatment had reduced the biological community to near zero. And without biological activity, there was no organic matter being produced, and without organic matter, the soil had no capacity to retain what water fell on it. By mid-July, the bare earth between the monoculture rows had baked to a surface that behaved in practical terms like fired clay, hard, impermeable, hot, reflecting the sun upward into the corn plants above it rather than absorbing it. The corn turned yellow at the tips. First, the earliest stress signal, the leaf margins crisping and rolling inward as the root systems exhausted the available moisture and found nothing beneath. The shallow roots that monoculture corn develops, shallow because the soil above them has been tilled and chemically treated in ways that discourage deep root development, could not reach the retreating water table. The county got a fierce afternoon thunderstorm in the third week of July, a genuine downpour of the kind that would normally relieve drought stress significantly, and the rain sheeted off the hard-pan fields without penetrating, carrying topsoil from the bare sections between rows, leaving the ground less able to absorb water than it had been before the storm. Farmers stood at the edges of their fields and watched their year's work die. These were not careless men. They were not bad farmers. They were good farmers, operating a system that had been designed for normal years and that had no resilience built into it for the specific kind of failure that extreme heat and prolonged drought produced. The system was efficient for extraction in good conditions and catastrophically vulnerable when the conditions changed, and the conditions had changed. From the county road along the eastern edge of the Weston property, the contrast was visible to anyone who drove past, and everyone who drove past slowed down to look at it. To the east, Callahan's fields, and beyond them the neighboring farms, the corn rows visible as lines of yellow-brown stalks against pale, cracked earth, the whole landscape having the color and the texture of something that had given up. To the west, Clara's 900 acres green and dense and implausibly alive, the corn stalks moving in the small, hot breeze, the bean vines climbing high, the squash canopy, a continuous and unbroken cover from fence line to fence line. Dale came back from town in the third week of July with the specific expression of a man who has heard things that have confirmed something he already suspected. "They're calling it the island," he said. "People are driving out of their way to look at it. What are they saying about it? Mostly that they don't understand it." He paused. "Some of them are saying there must be something wrong with their soil readings, or that you're irrigating from some source nobody knows about." "What do you say?" "I tell them to look at the squash canopy and think about what it's doing to the soil temperature underneath it." "What do they say to that?" "Most of them haven't thought about soil temperature before." He was quiet for a moment. "They're starting to, though." The squash was doing what it had always done, what it had been bred over centuries to do, what her father's journals had described with a precision that now seemed, in the context of the July heat, almost prophetic. The enormous leaves, and they were truly enormous in the fourth year of an established system, larger than anything, a first-year planting produced the result of root systems that went deep and drew on soil moisture and nutrition that the shallower plantings of earlier seasons had not been able to access, spread across the ground between the mounds in a canopy that from above would have been nearly unbroken. Beneath that canopy, the soil was protected from direct sunlight. The evaporation that was stripping moisture from every exposed field in the county was not happening beneath the squash leaves, because the mechanism that drove evaporation, the sun's direct radiation on the soil surface, was blocked by the canopy. The dew that formed in the brief cool of the early mornings before the heat built was being held against the soil surface rather than burned off at 7 a.m. The moisture in the soil was staying where it was. The corn stalks rising through the canopy and into the open air above it were not immune to the heat, but they had roots that went deeper than the monoculture corn around them because the soil they grew in had the structure and the biological activity that encouraged deep rooting, and those deep roots were finding moisture that the surrounding farm's root systems could not reach. And the bean vines climbing the corn stalks were in the relatively protected zone between the corn and the canopy, partially shaded by both experiencing something closer to tolerable conditions than anything exposed to the direct July sun. It was not a perfect defense. It was not an invulnerability. In a drought severe enough and prolonged enough, even the Three Sisters system would have failed, would have been pushed beyond the capacity of even the healthiest soil to compensate for the absence of rain. But 1973 was not that drought. 1973 was a hard drought, a damaging drought, a drought that would bankrupt farms and change lives and be talked about for decades. It was not the total catastrophe that would have overwhelmed everything. And in a drought that was hard but not total, the difference between soil that had been built for resilience and soil that had not was the difference between a harvest and nothing. Roy Callahan came to her door on the 22nd of July. She heard the truck in the lane from the kitchen where she was eating lunch, something she did quickly and without much attention when she was in the middle of a critical growing period, sitting at the table for 15 minutes with whatever she had made her mind already in the fields. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him park and get out and come toward the house, and what she saw in the way he moved was something she had not seen before from Roy Callahan, who moved through the world with the easy, settled authority of a man who is certain of his position and has never had reason to revise that certainty. What she saw now was a man carrying something heavy, moving the way you move, when the weight of a thing is not external but internal, when you are carrying it in the chest rather than the hands. She let him knock twice before she opened the door. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and looked at her, and his face was the face of a man who has been reduced to something more basic than he was comfortable being. The authority was still there, the physical presence, the years of accumulated standing in the community. Those things don't disappear in a single season, even a season like this one. But underneath them, visible now in a way it hadn't been before, was something more human. A man in trouble trying to figure out how to say so to a person he had been certain for 4 years would be in trouble long before he was. "I need to ask you something," he said. She waited. He told her about the corn yield projections, which were catastrophic. He told her about the irrigation, the pumps running continuously, drawing on the aquifer at a rate that the aquifer was not replenishing, the water table dropping week by week. He told her about the hardpan, which he had noticed himself now in his east field, the way the rain ran off rather than soaking in. He asked her about her wells, about her soil, about whether there was any water she could share, any method she could recommend that might salvage something from the remaining weeks of the season. She looked at him for a moment. "Roy," she said the first time she had used his first name 4 years into their adversarial proximity, and he noticed it. She could see him notice it. "Your soil cannot hold water right now, no matter how much you give it. The hardpan in your east field goes down 18 inches. I've been able to see the surface structure from the fence line. The organic matter is gone. The biological community is gone. There is nothing that can be done for those fields this season. Not by me, not by anyone." He looked at her. He did not argue, which surprised her. Arguing was what she had expected. What she saw instead was a man updating his model of reality in real time, receiving information that his previous model had told him he would never receive from this source, and processing it with the specific quiet pain of someone who has been wrong about something in a way that costs. "How long did it take you," he said, "to get your soil to where it is?" 4 years, she said, "from scratch in the first season." He nodded. He turned and looked out at the county road, at the landscape beyond it, the brown and brittle world that the July heat had made the fields dying in the distance. He turned back. "I put everything on the corn this year," he said quietly. "Everything I had." "I know," she said. "I'm sorry, Roy." She watched his truck move down the lane and turn north onto the county road and disappear, the dust hanging in the still hot air long after the truck was out of sight. She stood at the porch railing for a while, looking at the fields, thinking about how a drought doesn't care about intentions or histories or the complicated human stories that get attached to pieces of land. A drought is just physics, the physics of evaporation, exceeding precipitation of roots, outrunning moisture of soil structure, either helping or not. The drought was not making a judgment. It was just showing what was there. Arthur Pruitt's dark sedan appeared in her driveway on the 1st of August. He had driven out from Hayes without calling first, which was unusual. He parked carefully in the yard and got out in his suit, which looked as wrong in the August heat as it always did in a field context, and he looked at her and at the fields and said nothing for a moment. She had the sense that he had driven the county road before turning into her lane, that he had seen the two fields side by side from the road and had needed to drive in and see it close to believe what he had seen. She walked with him to the fence line without speaking. They stood there together and looked at both fields, hers to one side, Callahan's to the other, the difference between them as complete and clear as an argument with only one side remaining. Pruitt bent down. She had not anticipated this. A man in a good suit in August in Kansas, in the middle of a drought, bending down in a field to push aside a squash leaf with one hand and press the other flat against the earth. He held his hand there, and the expression on his face as he did this was something she would remember for the rest of her life. The expression of a man encountering physical evidence that contradicts a deeply held belief, the specific quality of surprise that comes from touching something you had been told was not possible, and finding that it is not only possible, but present, unmistakable, cool against your palm. He crumbled the soil between his fingers. He looked at it. He stood up. 47 farms, he said. On my books. You are the only one current on the loan. He looked at the horizon. Callahan will go to foreclosure. Within 60 days, probably faster. 3 others in the same position, maybe more by September. This is going to be the land transfer from this season is going to be larger than anything we've seen since the 30s. He paused. He looked at his hands, at the dark soil still on his fingers. He looked at her. "Clara," he said, and his voice had a quality she had not heard from him before. Not the banker's careful neutrality, not the managed professional sympathy of their earlier conversations, but something more direct, more human. The voice of a man who has arrived at a place he had not planned to arrive at and is being honest about where it is. I designed that first loan to be insufficient. I want to say that plainly to you. I designed it that way deliberately because I believed it was the most responsible way to manage what I was certain was an inevitable foreclosure. I thought I was being practical. I thought I was reducing harm. He paused. I was being incurious. I looked at what you were doing and decided I understood it before I understood it, and I was wrong. And that matters, because there are farmers in this county who are losing everything right now, who might not be if the bank had been asking different questions 4 years ago. He held out his hand. "I'm sorry." She shook his hand. Not warmly, not coldly, honestly, which was the only way she knew how to do things by then. He drove away. She stood at the fence line until his car was a small shape on the county road, and then she turned back to the fields and walked through them in the late afternoon. The August heat still intense, but the evening coming on, the light beginning to shift toward the long shadows of a Kansas summer evening. She walked among the corn and the beans and the squash and listened to the sounds the field made, the small sounds, the insect sounds, the wind through the leaves, and felt the specific satisfaction of a person who has built something real and has watched it be tested and has seen it hold. The harvest that fall was not a record crop, and she had never expected it to be. It was what it was, the product of a system that had been building for 4 years toward a test it had just passed in a county where passing any test at all in the summer of 1973 was an achievement that the market was prepared to price accordingly. She began hiring in September as the harvest approached. The labor pool was larger than it had ever been. The bankrupt farms were laying off hands, good men who knew farming and needed work, men who had heard about the island from the county road, and who came to work for her with the quiet attention of people who are in the process of revising their understanding of something they thought they knew. They pulled corn from stalks intertwined with living bean vines and loaded squash from under the protective canopy and worked through the harvest with a focus that she had not expected and that told her they were watching as well as working, paying attention to what they were handling and what it meant. Dale was there from the first day to the last, moving through the harvest with the focused competence of a man who knows what he's doing, because he has been doing it carefully for 4 years, whose knowledge of this specific farm and this specific system was by now as deep and as practical as any knowledge Clara possessed. He managed the day workers with the quiet authority of someone who has earned rather than been given his position, and at the end of each day, he brought her the numbers and the observations, and they sat at the kitchen table and went through them together in the easy, practical shorthand that develops between people who have been working toward the same thing for a long time. The grain elevators in the county were close to empty by October. What Clara brought to them was in the context of that autumn something very close to the only supply available from the immediate region. The buyers came to her. The prices they offered reflected the arithmetic of scarcity with the brutal clarity that markets produce when the supply side of an equation has collapsed. She sold everything, every bushel of corn, every pound of beans, every last piece of the enormous squash harvest, at prices that bore no resemblance to the prices of any previous year in her experience. She sold it all, and the numbers she wrote down at the end of the season were numbers she had not imagined writing when she had stood in her father's office 4 years earlier with the journals in her hands and the county's certainty pressing in from every direction. She walked into the First Agricultural Bank of Hayes on a Tuesday morning in the first week of November. The lobby was occupied by several farmers she recognized sitting in the waiting chairs with the specific stillness of people waiting for news that will not be good. Their hats in their hands, their faces carrying the complicated expression of men who had worked hard their entire lives and were now sitting in a bank waiting to be told what that work had amounted to. She did not stop. She went upstairs. She sat down across from Arthur Pruitt and placed a cashier's check on the desk in front of him. The full balance, principal and interest and 4 years of accumulated obligation in a single payment. He looked at the check. He looked at her. He did not speak for a moment, and she did not expect him to, because there was nothing adequate to say, and he was intelligent enough to know it. She said, "Thank you for your time, Mr. Pruitt." She went downstairs and through the lobby past the farmers in the waiting chairs and out into the November morning. The foreclosure auction for the Callahan farm was held on the 4th of December in the county assessor's office, a room that smelled of dust and old paper and institutional heating, a room in which things were transferred from one set of hands to another by the mechanism of financial necessity. It was a small room for a large event. There were perhaps 15 people present, bank representatives, 2 or 3 professional land speculators from Hayes who attended these auctions regularly, 1 or 2 neighboring farmers cautiously interested in expansion. Roy Callahan was in the back corner. He was standing alone near the wall, slightly apart from the other people in the room, and he was wearing the same work clothes he had worn when he came to her door in July. He looked like a man who had been stripped of the things that had defined him, not his character, not his basic decency, which was real despite everything but the outer things, the things that had been built up over 40 years of success and standing, and the particular confidence of a man who has been right about most things most of the time and has never had a strong reason to question his rightness. Those outer things had been taken by the summer, and what was left was something quieter, and she thought more genuinely him. She had prepared her number carefully. She had walked the fence lines of that land in the summer and pressed her hands against the hardpan and taken informal samples and assessed what the restoration would cost in time and labor and patience. She had calculated the years it would take to bring the soil back to the baseline she had started from on the original Weston acreage, and the years beyond that before it would reach the condition of the land she had been building for 4 years. She knew what she was buying. She was not buying a functioning farm. She was buying 840 acres of damaged earth and a challenge she knew how to accept. She raised her card when the bidding reached her number. No one bid against her. The gavel came down. She turned before leaving and looked at Callahan across the room. He was looking at her. The distance between them was maybe 20 feet across, a room that had already half emptied, the other bidders moving toward the door, the bankers gathering their papers. In that distance, across 4 years of adversarial proximity and competing certainties, something passed between them that was not the clean resolution of a narrative, but something more complicated and more honest. The recognition of two people who had each staked everything on a version of the truth, who had each paid the price their version demanded, and who were now standing in the same room after the test had been run and the results were in. He nodded. She nodded. She walked out into the December air. The paper that Harold Finch published in the spring of 1974 was 43 pages in the Journal of Agronomy, data-dense and carefully qualified in the way of scientific papers whose authors know they are making significant claims and want to be unassailable on methodology. The data it presented: nitrogen content, organic matter levels, water retention, coefficients, microbial biomass, earthworm population density, was clear enough and reproducible enough that the scientific community's response was not dismissal, but engagement, which was a different and more productive kind of challenge. Other researchers came to Kansas. Other researchers took samples and ran their own analyses. The data held. The conversation it started was a long one. It is still going on. Over the years, the language of that conversation changed and developed as the research field grew. People gave names to what Clara had been doing, the way scientists give names to things that exist before the naming soil: health management, integrated, polyculture, regenerative systems, agriculture, and finally, the phrase that seemed to settle into wide use and stay there, the phrase that appeared in increasing numbers of academic papers and agricultural extension bulletins, and eventually in mainstream agricultural journalism: regenerative agriculture. Clara read about it. She found the conversation interesting and the terminology useful, and occasionally found herself smiling at the way in which a specific instance of something she had been doing on a specific farm in Kansas for a decade was being generalized into a framework and a movement and a school of thought, the way things that work tend to become eventually theories. She called what she practiced farming. The University Extension Office sent a graduate student in the summer of 1975. He was earnest and well-prepared and somewhat overwhelmed by the difference between what he had read about in the literature and what he was standing in the middle of. She walked him through the fields and answered his questions and showed him the soil and let him take his samples. He came back the following year with colleagues. They kept coming back, different configurations of researchers and students, and Clara answered their questions and walked them through the fields and showed them what she knew, which by then was substantial enough to fill several courses that she was never officially credited with teaching. The farm grew over the years in the quiet way of things that are tended rather than forced. The Callahan land took 7 full years to restore, 7 years of cover crops and compost and careful work with the Three Sisters rotation and the additional techniques she had developed since the first season. By the end of those 7 years, The soil on the former Callahan property was biologically and structurally indistinguishable from the original Weston acreage. 2 more parcels came to her over the following decade, both damaged in the familiar ways, both restored by the patient application of what she knew. The total operation grew to nearly 3,000 acres, managed with an efficiency that bore no resemblance to the industrial model and was more efficient than that model in every way that ultimately mattered: lower input costs, stable and increasing fertility soil that sustained rather than consumed itself, systems that required less intervention as they matured rather than more. Dale Morrow stayed. He became over the years something more than an employee without ever having a conversation about becoming something more. These transitions happen in farming partnerships, the way they happen in long relationships, generally through the accumulation of shared work and shared knowledge and shared belief in the thing you are both building, until the distinction between employer and employee is less accurate than the description partners. He brought Patricia, who taught school in Hayes, and who became part of the operation in the way of people who marry into farming families gradually through proximity and contribution until the farm was as much hers as anyone's. Their children grew up on the land, which was something Clara had not anticipated, and which added a dimension to the farm that she had not planned for and would not have traded. Arthur Pruitt retired in 1981. In what was one of the smaller ironies of the story, he spent the final years of his career as an advocate for soil health criteria in agricultural lending, the exact reversal of the position he had held for 22 years, arrived at by the root of having been comprehensively wrong about something that mattered. He sent Clara a personal letter when he retired, which was unusual enough to be significant. A letter that thanked her for the conversation in August of 1973, and that said, without asking for absolution, that he hoped she understood the scale of what she had built. She wrote back and said that she was glad he understood it too. Roy Callahan found his way back to farming smaller-scale different methods with the particular care of a man who has had his assumptions tested to destruction and has rebuilt them more carefully on the other side of the experience. He leased 40 acres from a neighbor in 1977 and began again without the large machinery and the certainty and the financial leverage that had characterized his previous operation. He came to the Weston farm twice over the following years, and on both occasions he and Clara walked the fields together, and she showed him what she did without commentary, and he watched with the attention of a man who has finally become genuinely curious about something he spent a long time being certain about. She was 61 years old the summer she walked the fields with her granddaughter. The girl was 14, with her great-grandfather's quality of attention, that specific, unhurried way of looking at things that doesn't rush to name what it sees, that stays, with the observation long enough for the observation to develop into something more than a first impression. She had his eyes, or something functionally equivalent to them, the eyes of someone who notices. The farm on that morning was everything and more than what her father had dreamed in his secret journals on the bottom shelf of the office. The 3 sisters still grew in their ancient configuration across the whole of the original acreage and the restored land beyond it, because they were the foundation, the act that had made everything else possible, and she had never seen a reason to change the foundation. Around and among them in the rotation she had refined over decades grew the cover crops and the legumes and the deep-rooted perennials that fed the soil through the fallow periods that built organic matter and maintained the biological community that was the engine of everything the farm produced. The hedgerows that her father had wanted but never planted were tall now, full of birds and insects that represented a different kind of productivity than the kind measured in bushels per acre. The creek that ran through the southern section was clear and healthy in its restored bed, supporting populations of organisms that the university biologists came to study every spring. She led the girl to the office. The room still had something of her father in it, whether it was truly the smell of his tobacco after all these years, or whether she had simply held it in memory long enough for it to be present. Regardless of whether it was actually there, she could not have said, and the distinction no longer seemed important. She went to the bottom shelf of the bookcase, moved aside the agricultural manuals that were still there, still unread, still serving the same purpose they had always served, and took down the 3 leather-bound journals. They were worn through at the corners now, the leather blackened and softened, with decades of handling, the pages swollen slightly and soft at the edges, the whole assembly having the look of something that had been used completely and without reservation for exactly what it was made for. She placed them in her granddaughter's hands. The girl took them with both hands and looked at them for a moment, the worn covers, the weight of them, the density of what they contained, and then looked up. "Grandma," she said. Her voice had the quality of someone standing at the edge of something large, trying to see the full extent of it. "What was the secret? How did you do it when everyone else failed?" Clara looked out the window. The fields were moving in the morning light, the slow and specific motion of a healthy crop in a gentle wind, the corn and the beans and the squash, doing what they had been doing on this land for 50 years now, the leaves turning toward the light, the roots going down into the dark, the whole extraordinary ordinary system proceeding in its ancient, patient, reliable way. She thought about Earl Hicks at the co-op, the laughter moving through the room on a Tuesday morning in June 1969, the specific sound of a community enforcing its sense of what was possible. She thought about Arthur Pruitt's hands in the August soil, dark soil, cool against his pale banker's fingers, the expression on his face when he stood up. She thought about Roy Callahan in the back of the auction room, his arms at his sides nodding across 20 feet of institutional carpet. She thought about Dale, 23 years old and skeptical, sitting in the barn with the first journal in his hands, and the expression of a man whose categories were being quietly rearranged. She thought about him 30 years later walking the fields before the sun was fully up because he wanted to see what the morning did to the dew on the squash leaves. She thought about her father alone in this room late at night, writing in secret about a world that the county could not yet imagine, writing about cooperation and patience and the intelligence of systems that human agriculture had abandoned in favor of systems that were more efficient in the short run and more fragile in every way that ultimately mattered, writing with the quiet passion of a man who knew something true and did not know what to do with knowing it, leaving the evidence behind on a bottom shelf wrapped in leather, patient as the earth it described, waiting for someone who might be braver than he had been. She looked at her granddaughter's face, at the careful attention there, at the way the girl held the journals with both hands, with the instinctive care of someone who understands that what she is holding is not merely old, but significant. "They told me," Clara said, "that you couldn't run a machine through a field like that." The girl waited. "They were right," Clara said. Her voice was quiet and clear and entirely certain. What they never thought to ask was whether the field, if you gave it enough time and treated it with enough respect and listened to it with enough patience, could learn to run itself. She looked at the journals in her granddaughter's hands. She looked at the fields outside the window. She looked at the girl's face, and in it she saw her father's curiosity and her own stubbornness, and the long, patient work of a family that had learned over 2 generations to ask the right question and then to stay. "That's all farming is," she said. "Asking the right question and being willing to stay long enough for the land to answer." Outside, the Kansas morning was bright and clean, and entirely itself the kind of morning that this land produced in abundance when you gave it reason to. And the corn moved in its long, slow wave across the hill, and the beans climbed toward the light with the unhurried certainty of things that know what they are doing, and the great squash leaves turned their faces to the sun. 3 sisters still tending each other after all these years, still doing the ancient work, still keeping faith with the ground beneath them, and the sky above, still running themselves.